Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 334, The Battle of Kursk. Last time, we covered the life and accomplishments of the father of method acting, Konstantin Stanislavski. Today, we cover the largest tank battle in human history, the Battle of Kursk, whose reverberations stay with us to this very day. My primary sources for today's episode include The Battle of the Tanks, Kursk, 1943 by Lloyd Clark, Moment of Battle, The 20 Clashes That Changed the World by James Lacey and William Murray, and Stalin, The Court of the Red Tsar by Simon Sebag Montefiore. The Battle of Kursk was, along with the Battle of Stalingrad and the failure of Operation Barbarossa, a major turning point in the Eastern Front War between the Soviet Red Army and Nazi Germany. There was one difference with this immense conflict. The famed Russian winter had no part in the loss suffered by the Germans. Beginning on July 5th, 1943, and lasting until August 23rd, the enormity of the consequences of this monumental battle is hard to overstate. It would start with Operation Citadel, the German offensive aimed at the Kursk salient, and would end with the Belgorod-Kharkov offensive operation by the Soviet Red Army. Before we get into the details, I'd like to read part of the introduction from the book The Battle of the Tanks, Kursk, 1943 by Lloyd Clark. Quote, "The Battle of Kursk was the greatest land battle the world has ever seen on a fighting front that epitomized total war. Here was a barbaric campaign of passion and intensity, which was deeply rooted in ideology and centered on annihilation. It was a confrontation characterized by hideous excesses and outrageous atrocities, involving the two largest national armies ever amassed, and fought over 4 years in operations stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea. It concluded with Germany having incurred nearly 3 million military dead, and the Soviet Union a staggering 10 million. The Soviet losses alone equated to the total number of dead from all belligerent nations on all fronts during the Great War." Here's where Clark shares some absolutely staggering statistics. Quote, "Every week, Stalin's armed forces accumulated a football stadium's worth of dead, and every 3 months mourned as many lives as the United States did in the entire war. 17 million civilians also perished as a direct result of the fighting between June 22, 1941 and May 8, 1945, in a conflict that set new standards in depravity and inhumanity. It was a war that proved to be another national trauma and a turbulent century for the Soviet Union's ill-fated population, one that placed the enemy on the outskirts of their capital city and demanded seemingly endless sacrifice before it was all over." To put this into perspective, when it comes to the male population of the Soviet Union, quote, "In 1941, on the eve of the German invasion, the Soviet male population stood roughly at 94 million. By the first post-war census in 1946, that number had plunged to about 74 million, a loss of some 20 million men. It would take about 14 years for the country to counter the loss of men. The ratio of men to women never recovered during Soviet times and has still not fully recuperated to this day. Add the loss of male lives in the invasion of Ukraine today, this is making a problem a significant issue in Russia today. Before moving forward, we need to situate ourselves and define a few terms we will be using often in this episode. First, Kursk is located in the far western region of Russia. Secondly, we need to define what a salient is. A salient, also known as a bulge, is a battlefield feature that projects into enemy territory. The salient is surrounded by the enemy on multiple sides, making the troops occupying the salient vulnerable. An example would be the Battle of the Bulge, where the Germans penetrated deep into Allied lines in 1944, creating a vulnerable salient. There is something similar known as a pocket within a salient. The Germans used this effectively within their blitzkriegs at the beginning of World War II. They would create a small pocket of enemy forces and try to annihilate them quickly. This was part of the plan with Operation Citadel. While the focus of the German military operation was centered on Kursk, the German offensive targeted a bulge in the front measuring roughly 150 miles or 240 kilometers across and 100 miles or 100 kilometers deep into Soviet-held territory. After the devastating losses of men during Operation Barbarossa and the defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad, the German army was woefully understaffed, with only their tank divisions available for a full-scale attack. So, who were the major players in the Battle of Kursk? On the Russian side, the Deputy Supreme Commander was the inimitable General Georgy Zhukov, with Stalin, of course, pacing in the background. The commander of the Central Front was General Konstantin Rokossovsky, and the Voronezh Front was led by Nikolai Vatutin, and the Steppe Front was led by General Ivan Konev. On the German side, the plan was proposed by Generalfeldmarschall Erich von Manstein, with the approval of Adolf Hitler, of course. He was joined by Gunther von Kluge, Walter Weiss, Walter Modell, and Erich Heinrich Klosner, all from Army Group Center. From Army Group South, they had Erich von Manstein, Hermann Hoth, and Werner Kempf. Army Group North was still dealing with the siege of Leningrad. The number of men involved was staggering, but it also clearly shows that the Soviet Red Army was beginning to show a significant numbers advantage, something that the Germans were not fully aware of. The Soviets fielded 1.4 million actual combat soldiers, 5,128 tanks, and 25,000 guns and mortars. On the German side, it's estimated they had about 780,000 fighting troops, 2,900 tanks, and almost 10,000 guns and mortars. As you can see, the Red Army was vastly superior in numbers across the board. Some have argued that the German tanks were better than their Soviet counterparts. While this is true when it comes to firepower, the German Panzers and Tigers were notorious for their poor reliability as compared to the Soviet T-15/76 tanks. Even though the Red Army had the numbers, they had one other extremely important advantage. They had a spy network that fed them information about the German buildup and attack plans. This was to be crucial to the eventual Soviet victory. There was one other significant advantage the Soviet Union had over Nazi Germany, and that was the approach each dictator took when it came to planning the war effort. Whereas Hitler continued his delusional belief that he was a genius tactician, despite the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, Joseph Stalin understood his limitations as a military strategist. His selection of Georgy Zhukov as Deputy Supreme Commander, as well as making Alexander Vasilevsky the Chief of the General Staff and General Alexei Antonov the Chief of Operations, ensured that capable professionals would guide the Red Army under the extreme pressure of war. The Soviet Red Army felt that they were now in a great place to destroy the Nazi Wehrmacht after the annihilation of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army at the Battle of Stalingrad. They were so confident that in early 1943, they began to race westward, retaking Kharkov, Belgorod, and Kursk. Unfortunately for them, this rapid movement caused them to overreach their lines. On February 19th, 1943, things for the Red Army took a decided turn for the worse. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Hitler's finest generals, attacked the overly stretched out lines of the Soviet military. It was a smashing defeat up and down the lines. Kharkov and Belgorod were quickly recaptured, with Kursk in the German army's sight by mid-March. This maneuver, though, exhausted the Wehrmacht to the point that even the increasingly erratic Hitler refused Manstein's request to keep pushing. Even Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commander of Army Group Center, insisted his men required a much-needed period of rest. Then the weather turned in Germany's favor with the typical cycle of rain and mud during late spring. This brought all sides to a screeching halt. It also gave both sides a look at the new lines, with both the German High Command and the Soviet Stavka realizing that there was a massive bulge in the Red Army's lines, about 70 miles wide, with a 250-mile perimeter that put them at a considerable disadvantage. Hitler saw this massive salient and ordered his generals to fill the front lines with as many troops and tanks as they could muster. Unfortunately for the Germans, there were not enough men or tanks to bring their forces up to their target strength. The losses in the 2 previous years of fighting had all but sapped any reserves the Germans had. To make things worse, the Germans were being routed in Tunisia, ending their occupation in northern Africa. Hitler also had to shore up his defenses in Sicily as they were alerted to the inevitable invasion. Still, they were duped as to where the troops would land for the deception before Operation Mincemeat, which is the invasion of Sicily, commenced. While the Germans were attacking the Soviet lines sporadically, they were unable to make any headway, and it further weakened them. What became apparent to the Soviet military leadership was that their counterparts were using the same old blitzkrieg strategies. At the same time, the Red Army began to recover from the purges in the 1930s with new tactics and a significant increase in their mechanical capabilities with new tanks, planes, Katyusha artillery, and anti-aircraft units filling their ranks. As Lloyd Clark writes in his book, The Battle of the Tanks, quote, "By the spring of 1943, the Soviet Union was not only outproducing Germany, but the modernization of its military and updating its fighting methods meant that Stalin could fight on a more equal term with Hitler than he could before." Hitler was now convinced by Manstein that an attack on the Kursk salient was the prudent thing to do and would succeed despite the weaker position his army had because, well, Germany. Well, Hitler knew the Soviets were improving their military might, but still, he was so sure of German superiority that he ordered Operation Citadel to commence as soon as possible, fearing that they were giving the Red Army too much time to build a strong defensive line. When Citadel was put into action on July 5th, 1943, it was already too late. The Soviet army was well prepared and ready to take on the Germans. By March, Field Marshal Heinz Guderian warned Hitler and the other generals that the plan was too flawed and would lead to the eventual destruction of the entirety of the German military. Manstein reluctantly agreed with this assessment, but Hitler did not. He would have Operation Order No. 6 to be announced on April 15th. It read, quote, "The objective of the attack is to surround the enemy forces in the Kursk sector and destroy them with concentric attacks. The moment of surprise must be preserved and, above all, the enemy must be kept in the dark about the date of the attack. the attack must be conducted so rapidly that the enemy can neither withdraw from contact nor bring in strong reserves from other fronts. The original date for the beginning of Operation Citadel was slated for May 3rd, but the Germans were not quite ready to launch their attack. This allowed the Soviets to better prepare the defenses. Still, there was that one advantage they had over the Germans, and that was better intelligence, especially from one of their allies, Great Britain. They had already broken the Germans' quote-unquote unbreakable code, which was transmitted via their Enigma cipher machines. The British, though, were very protective of this discovery and only shared small tidbits of information, fearful that the Germans might figure out what they had accomplished through their ultra-decryption operation at Bletchley Park in Birminghamshire. Because of this information from the British, the Soviets knew what the German formations were, where they were most likely to attack. They devised the best ways to create impenetrable defensive positions. The Red Army had another intelligence agency working to their benefit, and it was known as the Red Trio Network, based out of Switzerland. While the agency, led by Sandor Rado, was short on details, its data was used to corroborate what other sources were feeding it. While the Soviets knew the plans for Operation Citadel, they were unsure of exactly when the attack would occur. Hitler, for his part, kept changing the date, which would frustrate Stavka, but they held firm, knowing that their plan had the best chance of succeeding. The Germans were well aware that the delay allowed their enemy time to build up their defenses. Still, Hitler was supremely confident in his armored divisions, with the new wonder weapons being delivered. The incoming supplies included the Panzerkampfwagen, the 6 Tiger heavy tank, Panzerjäger Tiger, the P, the Ferdinand heavy assault gun, and the Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther medium tank. Hitler believed that these superior weapons would win him the battle and eventually turn the tide of war against the Soviets. All of this preparation by the Germans was occurring while they were being swept out of northern Africa. The Italians, well, they were preparing to leave the war effort, and the Americans were preparing to invade Europe from the south and eventually the west. Hitler's generals, especially Heinz Guderian, warned the Fuhrer that Operation Citadel was risky and would likely not succeed. As the new weapons Hitler was so enamored with were not as reliable as he had hoped. In late May, Guderian warned Hitler at the Reich Chancellery, quote, "Do you believe, my Fuhrer, that anyone even knows where Kursk is? The world is completely indifferent as to whether we have Kursk or not. I repeat my question. Why do you want to attack in the east, particularly this year?" Hitler's reply was, quote, "You are quite right. The thought of this attack makes my stomach queasy." Despite all the doubt, the plan to attack the salient was still on. As the days of waiting wore on, the generals in the high command of the German army became restless. As General Friedrich Mellenthin would write after the war, quote, "For 2 months the shadow of Citadel hung over the Eastern Front and affected our thoughts and planning. It was disquieting to reflect that all of our training, our profound study of the art of war, and the bitter experiences of the past year, the German general staff should be dabbling with a dangerous gamble in which we were to stake our last reserves." As the weeks slipped by, it became abundantly clear that this was an operation in which we had little to gain and probably a great deal to lose. We are now in June of 1943, with the Germans gathering what was left of their eastern armies. According to Lloyd Clark in his book, quote, "The attacking forces amounted to 770,000 men, 2,451 tanks and assault guns, 70% of German armor on the Eastern Front, and 7,417 guns and mortars. The plan called for 4 German divisions to face the front of the salient, with General Gunther von Kluge's Army Group Center attacking from the north under General Walter Model's 9th Army. They would theoretically meet up with Army Group South, led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. This would collapse the Kursk salient, destroying the Soviet army, thus saving the war effort for the Germans. The only problem was, as I mentioned earlier, that the Soviets were more than ready for this and were building one of the most impressive defensive setups in world military history. The Kursk salient was a veritable fortress. Over 300,000 civilians were put to work in the months preceding the attack. Here is how James Lacey and Williamson Murray would describe the defenses the Soviet people built. Quote, consisting of successive defensive belts reaching back over 70 miles, crisscrossed by more than 3,000 miles of trenches and hundreds of miles of anti-tank obstacles, hundreds of camouflaged blockhouses and minefields that often numbered more than 3,000 mines per kilometer added to the defensive strength. This alone made the approaches to Kursk a death trap for any advancing army. But that was only the start. Throughout these defensive belts, the Soviets emplaced hundreds of anti-tank strongpoints, bristling with thousands of anti-tank guns and other tanks. Moreover, every inch of these defensive lines was within the range of thousands of artillery pieces, all registered on the most likely German approach routes. Add to this defensive bulwark were 2 million soldiers, a 2-to-1 advantage in the number of tanks, and over 32,000 guns and mortars. This was so overwhelming that even if the Germans were at full strength, they would have had no chance of succeeding. The attack would begin on July 4th, 1943, but just a small little poke, you might say. At first, the Germans would move forward, but slowly. But they were shocked by the ferocity of the artillery barrage the Red Army threw at them. By the evening, the advance had ground to a complete halt. What stunned the German High Command was the knowledge that the Soviet Red Army knew precisely where they would attack and had set up their defenses as though they had read the attack plans, which, of course, they had. As a Soviet soldier would remember the fighting, quote, the sky blackened from smoke and heat. The acrid gases from the exploding shells and mines blinded the eyes. The soldiers were deafened by the thunder of guns and mortars and the creaking of tracks. The motto became the words, not a step back, stand to the death. The infantry skillfully destroyed the tanks with grenades and bottles filled with mixtures of fuel. Under hurricane of tire, they stole up to the enemy with anti-tank grenades, set them on fire with incendiary bottles, and laid mines under them. While the Germans would begin to break out from the maelstrom, destroying entire Soviet tank divisions, they would be met with division after division of tanks that were relentless. By July 13th, only 8 days after the attack began, Hitler ordered that the offensive be called off. The Soviet losses were staggering. Over 175,000 men lost their lives, while the Germans lost about 54,000. The German army, though, had no more reserves, while the Red Army had millions. From that day on, the German Wehrmacht would play a defensive strategy until the end came in April 1945. Both sides, though, were exhausted, but the Germans faced added pressure with the invasion of Sicily and the inevitable attack on Italy. Added to that was the knowledge that the Allies were building up an army in Great Britain to invade France and open up a new front. As for the future after the war, as Lacey and Murray put it, quote, the course of history over the next 50 years, the Cold War was determined at Kursk. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Join me next time when we start a series, I think a two-part, not positive yet, but we're going to cover the Soviet space program, which came as a result of Kursk and the defeat of Germany in 1945. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.